Hi, and welcome to my talk, Show Me the Money, Energy Storage Systems Between the Technically Feasible and the Economically Viable. My name is Sonia Vogrin, and I'm an associate professor at Comillas Pontifical University. This is work that I've done together with my colleague, Diego Tejada Arango. The motivation for this work is that energy storage systems are going to play a very important role in the power system of the future. Everywhere in the world, they have ambitious policy goals, such as ENTSO-E, who claimed that by 2040, 80% of covered demand would be by renewables, or even a more ambitious target by the European Commission, which said that the entire electricity sector is going to be carbon neutral by 2050. Now, we know that energy storage systems are bound to play a very critical role on the path towards this future power sector. They can help with increasing the penetration of renewables, provide reserves, or even inertia. So technically speaking, there are a lot of things that energy storage systems can do for a power system. Now, the question is, which of these things, which of these services is actually going to be economically viable, not only technically feasible? And the reason for asking these questions is that most electricity systems in developed countries are liberalized electricity markets, which means that they're private entities competing in these markets, and they need new investments and services to be profitable in order to be provided. If they're not profitable, they're simply not going to be provided at all, which puts us in a very tough situation as consumers of electric energy. Now, the standard operations research literature has told us that if you plan a system in a cost minimizing way, then every technology is going to recover its costs fully. And Corpus and Botterud, in a recent paper of theirs, they go even one step further and say that this keeps being true even if you include storage and renewables in the mix. However, we're wondering, in the literature, and when they do these proofs, usually these works are very, very theoretical in order to be able to derive those proofs, and they don't take into account technical operating conditions like unit commitment constraints, for example. So the research question that we set out to answer in this work is that, are energy storage systems really going to be economically viable in a 100% renewable power system? Or as they say in a very famous movie called Jerry Maguire, show me the money. You know, if it's not going to be sure that there is enough money in it for me, is it actually really going to happen? How are we going to go about to actually answer this question? We developed an optimization model, which is a low carbon expansion generation optimization model, or as we lovingly refer to it, the LEGO model. And each of these, and the LEGO model is an optimization model that's very modular, and there are different aspects and LEGO blocks to it. So for example, it's a minimization model that decides expansion decisions, but it also takes into account technical constraints such as unit commitment, meaning we have startup and shutdown constraints, ramp rates, etc. But since our focus is going to be on energy storage technologies, we also need to have a very detailed representation of these storage constraints, meaning that there is a very wide spectrum of different storage technologies out there. There are batteries, which can have charging and discharging cycles over a couple of hours, and there are hydro dams, which can take charging and discharging cycles over several months or even years if you think about Brazil. So we try to find the middle ground to represent both of these different types of technologies in a reasonable way. We also include an option to have a policy target, meaning that we can do the business as usual case in which we really just go and plan our system depending on the best cost, the cost minimum, or we can plug in policy targets saying that we want a specific percentage of demand to be provided by renewables. A novelty of this work is that we also consider rate of change of frequency inertia requirements in this work. because this becomes important in a power system where you go more and more renewable and you start shutting off more synchronous generators, rock-off requirements become interesting here. And finally, we consider the full ACOPF via second-order cone programming approximation. The reason for that being reactive power support might not be a big deal in power systems currently. However, in power systems with a very high renewable penetration, this will become an important issue. If you're interested in the work, it's currently under review in Applied Energy and available on arXiv. Model results include generation investment decisions, operating decisions, power flow, prices, and calculating revenues, costs, and profits. We carry out a case study, and the data for it is this 9-bus system, which you see here in the graph. We have 13 transmission lines, an existing nuclear and hydro plant, different candidate units, thermal, gas-fired power plants, wind, solar, battery energy storage systems. And those candidate units are located where you can see them in the graph. The reason for not having all of these technologies available in all of the different buses is motivated by the fact that, for example, wind that is only available at bus number 5 usually is not built where people live, right? Because people try to tend not to live where it's very, very windy. For example, in Texas, this might be the case. The case study runs over a time horizon of 1 year, and the numbers that you see in percentages is where representing demand. Okay, so what we do is we run 2 different case studies. The business as usual case, where we don't have a policy target, and we can just freely build our both thermal and renewable technologies. Then we have the other opposite, which is the 100% renewables case, where we do have an explicit target, an explicit policy target that does not permit us to build any traditional thermal technologies. Nuclear is included here. So nuclear, we're not allowed to build nuclear either. And the reason for doing this in this particular case study was we were going kind of the European way, which might be dominated by, inspired by what Germany might be doing. So we're not trying to sell the story that nuclear is going to be our savior here. We really just want this to be renewables. Okay, so what is going to happen? In the business as usual case, we built about 2.5 megawatts of thermal, gas-fired power plants. Then we have 2.1 gigas of wind, 1.6 of solar, and 250 megawatts of batteries. Here you have some numbers about the overall system cost and so on and so forth. But what we really are interested in is, show me the money. How is the profitability of our storage facilities? And we're talking about the batteries here. So in total, this would be positive. So 35 million euros of profits. And you'd say, okay, the theory is right. They actually recover all of their costs and they have a profit. But if you dig a little bit deeper and you start converting this number in euro per megawatt number, you see 137 euros per megawatt hour. And you might be thinking, this is the business of a century. Let's all invest in batteries now. Especially thinking about the fact that this power system has an average price of 50 to 60 euros per megawatt hour. So where does this 137 come from? And the reason for this is that we have non-supplied energy. And in our model, we penalize non-supplied energy very, very heavily. And this means that this number is heavily influenced by the fact that we have non-supplied energy. Now you might say, okay, in all of the theoretical works, they also consider that, right? Because it's the classic piece of information that you say the technology that's on the margin really just recovers its costs when there are hours of non-supplied energy. And the fact that we have that here is not very surprising. However, on the other hand, and when you think about real power systems, then neither consumers nor system operators like non-supplied energy. So what we're doing was to say, okay, if we are investors, we might not want to gamble the business idea just, based on the fact that we're only going to recover costs during hours of non-supplied energy. So we ran a case where we said, let's just not allow non-supplied energy. Let's say this is zero. Then what happens? The overall system cost doesn't really change much, and the investment in batteries doesn't either. But look at what happens with the profits. Unfortunately, they go away, right? So the difference in these numbers really tells us that these initial profits that we were getting were highly or predominantly just based on the money that we were making on non-supplied energy hours. Okay, now another assumption that is usually made in these types of studies is that you have a perfectly competitive system, that your investments are going to be just as in a perfectly competitive market. Because if you decide the investments with the cost minimization model, which is what we do, this is your underlying hypothesis. Now, what if you actually did not have a perfectly competitive power system, which is usually what we do not have, right? Then couldn't you increase your profits by withholding capacity? And the answer is yes. So we ran this case study only allowing for 50 megawatts of new battery capacity. And what you can see is that you're actually getting better in terms of profit, right? You were minus 60 euro per megawatt hour before, and now you're minus 5. So you actually increased your profits by quite a bit in relative terms. So capacity withholding is an option. Now, if we go one step further to the 100% renewable case, we see, okay, we build a lot of solar. We don't build that much wind because it's at the very far off node and the transmission capacity is fixed. And we built almost 10 gigawatts of batteries, so a lot. Overall system cost is more expensive because you need to overbuild a lot of capacity, accounting for the fact that a lot of your generation capacity is intermittent. Now, what about profits now? Do you still recover your investment costs and your operation costs? And the answer is no, or at least in our case study, we saw that you do not recover your costs and you actually incur a lot of losses if you're a battery owner. Now, the question is, could you actually improve this profitability, which doesn't look very good at all, actually, by withholding capacity? And the answer is yes, you could, but, and this is a very important but, if you start to withhold capacity in batteries, you see non-supplied energy skyrocketing. The reason for this is that if you're in a power system that's really 100% renewable and you don't have any thermal dispatchable power plants as backup, what are you going to do on these very wonderful, calm summer nights where you don't have sun and you don't have wind? The only thing that's going to get you through the night are going to be your batteries. So really, when you start to withhold this battery capacity, you're just going to have non-supplied energy on a regular basis. And I think no power system in the world is aiming for that when we're moving towards a more renewable system. Having blackouts on a daily basis is not really what we're going for. Another thing that, like a curveball that I want to throw at you is what happens to inertia in low carbon power systems. Usually in planning models, they don't really take that into account. And if you don't take that into account, then this is what happens. Now, what you see here in the picture is a line of, the blue line is the renewable target that you set for yourself. And the red line is the actual renewable penetration that you are going to get in reality if you still want your system to be ROC feasible. Now, what are you doing? You're planning your system in generation expansion and you're disregarding the fact that you need inertia in your system. Then you lock in these investments and ex post, you say, okay, I'm not ROC feasible, so let me dispatch in a different way and operate my system in a different way. And when you're in the business as usual case, which is around like 30% of renewable penetration, you see that the fact that you have to dispatch differently doesn't really impact your system a lot. And the reason for this is that you have a lot of thermal synchronous generators dispatched. So that means that you can play around with just running them a little bit longer. But as you move towards a system with a very high renewable penetration, you're losing these synchronous generators that you can just dispatch for a longer time. And if you're going to the very extreme of 100% of renewable penetration, you have no more synchronous generator that can save you. So if you do not plan for actually building technologies that can provide you with inertia, you're going to have a big problem. And you're not going to be able to provide both a Rokov feasible system and a system that satisfies your renewable target. The good news is that this can be fixed relatively cheaply by, for example, investing in a couple of batteries that can provide inertia. And here I'm talking about virtual inertia, emulated inertia. But the downside of this is that if batteries are not profitable without having to provide an additional service like inertia, they're definitely not going to be feasible providing this additional service. So summing up and really coming to an end in this presentation, I see that in the power system of the future, energy storage systems really find themselves between a rock and a hard place, because they are completely indispensable in order to satisfy system demand in a 100% renewable power system. However, considering the amount that is necessary, this amount of new capacity is not going to be profitable. Maybe less capacity might be, but you really need all of it in order to not have non-supplied energy. On the other hand, storage system could provide inertia, which is essential service for power system stability, but large-scale deployment of virtual inertia is a really unknown territory in power systems. And on top of that, it's not that inertia is being remunerated anyway. So this doesn't help us either with getting anywhere close to being profitable. So the takeaway from this talk really is that we need to do further research on not only how to make better batteries, how to make them more efficient, because the fact that this is technically feasible, we already know. The thing that we need to work and focus on here also is to make this economically viable for new investors and for energy storage services in a liberalized low carbon electricity market. And with that, I want to thank you for your attention. And I would be very happy to take any questions, but you will have to send me an email for that. Thank you very much.